So Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o has influenced a lot of people worldwide, and there's still some people waiting to see if he could be awarded a Nobel Prize. So tell me about your interaction. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, if any, have you met him in person or you just read about him?
Yeah, first of all, if I were to talk about the prize, I would say Ngũgĩ deserves more than just the Nobel Prize, because for somebody that has given voices to the voiceless, and the voice of the voiceless through your voice, I think to me is more than the Nobel Prize. Now, last year in 2024, exactly on September 6th, is when I got a chance to meet with Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o in person for the first time. Sadly, that happened to be also my last time of meeting him in person. It was at the Kenyan Scholars and Studies Association Conference, or KESA Conference. And surprisingly, that day, the president of KESA, Professor Esther Obonyo, invited me, after learning about my research and my interest in Ngũgĩ's works. She invited me to give an opening remark before Ngũgĩ came to give his keynote speech at the conference. And that was the best moment in my life, because I got a chance to tell him in person about how much I admired his writing, and also how much I was appreciating his approach to African stories and African languages. So after that, I continued reading more about him in the library, interacting with his archives at Indiana University. And in fact, I was getting ready to travel to wherever he lives to meet him and talk with him as part of my dissertation, my PhD dissertation. But God had a different plan.
God had a different plan. It's interesting, actually, how this all pans out, because I was in Atlanta and I listened to you actually talk about all these works about Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o. The most interesting thing is that you did it in Swahili and in United States, and it was very interesting, because that's rare, and I think that captivated a lot of people.
One of the most notable areas or pieces I remember from Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o's keynote speech when he spoke at the KESA conference in 2024 is his stress on the importance of embracing our African languages in our academia, and the way we identify ourselves as educated people, quote unquote, educated people. We have to put African languages at the center, because for ages the current education system, which is Western education system, has made Western languages powerful over African languages.
His works, you've read about some of his books, I guess. Could you tell us some of the books that you read about Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o?
Yeah, I have read many of his works and other works written by other people about him. But one of his most influential works to me, still relevant today, is Decolonizing the Mind. This is the book right here.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Decolonizing the Mind by Ngũgĩ
Yeah.
wa Thiong'o. The Politics of Language in African Literature. Love the headline already.
Now, this book to me is more than just a book. It feels to me when I read it as a manifesto for African people, African young people, the writers, African scholars, and African citizens. Because Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o talks about what is supposed to be an African model of literature. How should we approaching our work? How should we be approaching our works in terms of the structure and content and the language? When we talk about language, it's not just language as the spoken language, a form of communication. No, we're talking about language as the general means of communication. How do our literatures communicate to the world? That is language of its own. So he talks about the concept of empty space, for example. Africa has always had theater and drama even before colonialism, Africa has always had a performance nature. Our life is performance in its nature. But that was changed by the narrative of colonialism in terms of our communicative language, but also the meaning and the motif of performance and how to understand it. It was changed during colonialism. So this book calls for us to revisit our elements of theater and our elements of drama and fiction and general literature, and how to start writing in our languages, but also understanding our space in theater. How do we fill out that empty space that always existed in Africa? But right now there are elements to think about and to fill those empty spaces with a new form of drama. So I think this work calls for a new understanding of not only African literature in Africa, but also African literature in the world, and to give African literature a new shape and new respect to the world face. So I would say with this work, Ngũgĩ has done his job. So it's all about reading this manifesto and then going about doing the work.
Personally, how do you feel about the whole shift of Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, shifting from writing literally in English and shifting to local dialects, specifically Kikuyu? What can you say?
I mean, Ngũgĩ was, and I would say for that matter, will always be a man of action, right? We have seen many people, they speak the things that they don't do. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o changed his name from James to Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, and all his kids are named in Kikuyu names. Ngũgĩ has not only told the stories of the Kikuyu mythology, but Ngũgĩ has lived his ancestry life. So I would say his use of African languages has not always been theoretical, it has always been practical. Ngũgĩ called for us to write in Swahili, and he said in Swahili and or any other African language that we were comfortable about writing. Because in Tanzania, for example, there is a prominent writer who also has already passed away a long time ago, Shaban Robert, who stands as an icon of Tanzanian literature. But that man is not recognized in the world face. When we talk about prominent writers in the world, you don't find Shaban Robert, and that's because he always wrote in Kiswahili. So Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o says, no, why don't we train and recruit our people to value African languages and give them a clear shape in the world, and remove ourselves from the periphery and take us to the center, so that our visibility can be introduced by our languages.
But Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o says, if you use your African language, or if the system of education in Africa introduces African languages as educational languages, it will not take down the power of the education that is being provided. I think as an educator myself, as a student as well, I have always been thinking about this and wondering why we don't value our own languages in education system, in our political system. We feel like using Western languages, say for example English or French, is or will make us sound powerful and most important in front of the world. But I think that is not the case. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o at that keynote speech added, as he has always been saying in other pieces that he has written or produced, that you can always add on your African language, any language of your choice. It could be a Western language or any other, but you don't have to feel obliged to own a European language for your education to be entitled to you. So that is one piece that I remember from Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o's keynote speech that still stands out to me until today.